ننتقل لدكتور سكوت إليسون. Doctor, I'm going to speak first in Arabic to introduce you, and then I can introduce you in English if you don't mind. Okay, thank you. دكتور سكوت إليسون هو من جامعة شمال آيوا في مركز التعليمي شندلر في لوس أنجلوس، قسم علم النفس، دكتوراه في الدراسات الثقافية في أسس التعليم، جامعة تينيسي في نوكسفيل. من التخصصات العلمية هي الدراسات الثقافية، علم الاجتماع، التعليم، فلسفة التعليم، الاتجاهات العالمية والوطنية في سياسة التعليم السياسية النقدية. كذلك له مجالات بحثية في التنمية النظرية الاجتماعية والفلسفة السياسية والدراسات الثقافية، وكذلك له اهتمامات في منهجيات النوعية المختلفة. I'm now going to just introduce you in English. Just give me a second. Dr. Scott Ellison, PhD, Cultural Studies in Education, Foundations from University of Tennessee at Knoxville. His dissertation was on a contradiction, the concept of globalization in the popular discourse of education reform. He specialized in cultural studies, sociology of education, philosophy of education. His research interest is in global and national trends in education policy, critical policy sociology and network analysis, political economy and development, social theory and political philosophy, culture studies and qualitative research methodology. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for being here. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. I hope that I have something to contribute to today's conversation. And I do especially want to thank my friend, Dr. Al-Subalan, for so very kindly inviting me to participate today. So I'm excited to be here, and I hope that I have something to contribute. With that being said, I do want to be very clear up front and truthful with you that I feel like my contribution today might be somewhat meager, because I find myself in kind of a weird space these days for an academic, in that I find myself in wrestling with a set of problems that I'm trying to wrestle with and think about how I can address these problems as a teacher and as an educator, and how I can help my students develop a pedagogy appropriate to this set of problems. However, I don't think I've solved the problem yet. I haven't figured out how to do this. So today, if you're expecting a clearly defined thesis or a program of study, I'm not sure I have that to offer today. So what I want to talk about is this problem space I'm in, this stuck place I'm in. And what I want to talk about is how I got here and how I'm thinking about how I'm going to get out of it as a teacher, as an educator at this moment. But just to be clear, what I'm talking about today is definitely not finished. It is not a complete work. It is something that I'm wrestling with right now. So with that said, here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how I got here, how I got into this problem space, and where I'm going. And to talk about that problem space, how I got here, I'm afraid I'm going to have to start with a bit of a shameless self-promotion, because the set of problems that I'm dealing with came out of the last project I just completed. And I published my first book back in the fall, and the name of the book is Education, Crisis, and the Discipline of the Conjuncture. And just to give you a little bit of background about me and this book and this project and where I'm coming from is, as Dr. Al-Subalan mentioned, my background is in cultural studies. And the way I think about cultural studies is that it is an intellectual practice that is defined by a commitment to radical contextualism. So let me put that in more common language. What I mean by that is that in cultural studies, we take everyday phenomena, things that are naturalized, that are taken for granted at work in society and politics and culture, And we try to contextualize it, to expose it to a radical contextualism, so that we take the everyday and the taken for granted and problematize it, to see it how it's entangled and bound up with larger societal trends and processes, to see it as a rich totality of many determinations. So in essence, what I did in this project and how I got in this stuck place is my project was something that's not generally associated with cultural studies, but really should be. Because what this work is it's historical periodization. Meaning what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand this historical moment in which I live and which we are all collectively living through. Trying to understand the terrain that we're all collectively navigating today. And I think this is important work for educators. And I think it's the strength of social foundations of education, because by definition, education is future oriented, right? It's oriented towards the future and helping young people be prepared for a dynamic and let's be honest, unpredictable future, right? But how we meet the challenges of the future is determined by our conceptualization and our understanding of the present, the historical moments in which we work. And that's what I'm up to in this project. So again, just let me map out this problem space I'm in and what I developed from the book. So as a cultural studies scholar, I wanted to start with something everyday and taken for granted. So in the United States, what I wanted to do is contextualize this, a dangerous politics that has risen to prominence in the United States in the 21st century. And I wanted to trace the development of it by looking at shifts in the economic, political, and cultural domains from the 1970s to today. Now, obviously, just by saying that's way too much material to cover in a 15-minute talk, and I'm not going to try, I promise. But I do kind of just want to briefly sketch this terrain just to give you an idea of what I'm wrestling with here. So in one chapter, I was examining the economic domain. And what I did is I traced the reemergence of neoclassical economics from the 1970s to today and how it spread from the United States across the global north and to the global south as well. And my goal was to examine how did we get to this point of growing economic inequality, growing economic polarization, and all of the antagonisms that we see at work in the world system today. In another chapter, I was looking at the political domain. And again, I was interested in this right-wing populism that's emerging, not just in the United States, but across the globe. And I was kind of tracing the development of this dangerous politics of us and them, meaning this kind of radical nationalism that frames all political debate and political discourse as a politics of us and them. You're either with us or against us. And I'm interested in understanding that the dangerous politics, how it cuts off meaningful debate and meaningful discussion and collaboration in the political sphere. And then in another chapter, I was looking at the cultural domain. And what I was interested there is popular culture. And specifically, I was interested in the explosion of media and news and information media, and specifically social media. And what I was interested there is how we've kind of fractured popular culture into increasingly closed off epistemic bubbles. Bubbles in which we're talking to one another and people who are like us and believe what we already believe. And we're closing off dialogue across differences, across political differences, cultural differences, and even regional and global differences, right? Cultural, ethnic, racial, and so forth. This fragmentation of shared reality and the dangerous politics and conspiracy theories and dangerous ideas that are taking root in these spaces. So what I was trying to do here, I mean, you can see that's a pretty expansive work I'm tackling here. But what I was trying to do is I was trying to map this terrain to understand this historical moment in which I'm trying to be a teacher and educator and help future teachers come into the profession and so forth, right? So, I live in the United States, and in terms of this analysis, my focus was on the United States. But of course, looking around the world, this is also a global phenomenon, right? This is relevant work from the Pacific Basin, across South Asia to Latin America to Europe and so forth. This is something that affects all of us. And of course, there was a topic that I did not discuss in the book, but I think is also relevant here, and that is global climate change. It is something that it's a challenge that we are all going to collectively face over the coming decades. So where did this lead me? So the thesis that came out of this book is that I argue that we're entering a period of conjunctural crisis. And what I mean by that is that we're entering a historical moment. We are currently living through a historical moment of multiplying crises, economic, cultural, and political and ecological crises that are conjoining in this historical moment. And I argue in the book that we find ourselves in a space that Antonio Gramsci would have called an interregnum, meaning a period of time in which the social formation that was constructed from the 1970s to today, it's a period in which the old is dying and the new cannot be born. So there's two ways that we can look at this interregnum. We could look at it from a rather optimistic way, right? Because in moments of crises, in moments of destabilization, that affords us opportunities to construct a new world system, one that is more tolerant, one that offers opportunities to create dialogue across difference and make a more progressive and humane world. But at the same time, it's a period of danger. And I think Gramsci really captured that when he described it as a period of time in which, quote, charismatic men of destiny can rise to power with catastrophic results. And I think as we look around the world system, we see, plenty of examples of that going on as well. So that's kind of where I find myself right now. I'm kind of in this liminal space. I'm thinking about how economic, political, and cultural crises are converging in this historical moment. And that book is my attempt to kind of map this historical moment and map this terrain. So here's what I'm wrestling with right now is, as an educator, as a social foundation scholar, what do I do with this? How do I bring this into the classroom? How do I help prepare young people for this future? How do I prepare future teachers to prepare young generations to meet the challenges of the future? So as a teacher, I started to think about, okay, if this is the problem, I'm a teacher, let's start thinking about curriculum, right? What are the bodies of knowledge that my students will need to meet this future? And immediately I was overwhelmed, right? We're talking about history, the history of social change. We're talking about geopolitics, political theory and changes in politics, economics, media studies. It just became very overwhelming. And then I started thinking about, okay, with all of these bodies of knowledge, how would I sequence this? How would I order it in developmentally appropriate means and so forth? And then I quickly realized that I was on the wrong track, that I was thinking about it in terms as a traditional teacher would. And it was leading me into this stuck place I'm talking about, this problem space, that it wasn't going to work for me anymore. And I've started toying around with this idea. And the way I think about it is that perhaps we've reached a moment in which curriculum is impossible. And what I mean by that is traditional ways of thinking about curriculum. Maybe the historical moment that we live in today is just too complex. When I started thinking about the map that I made, the project, I started thinking about how this is a lifetime of study. It would take a lifetime of study of disciplinary knowledge to really wrap your brain around the problem space I've constructed. So I started to think about, maybe I should shift away from that. How can I prepare my students in a way that doesn't focus on disciplinary knowledge, but focuses on, ways of thinking and being in the world? And then it hit me. Maybe the cultural studies method that I use to construct this map is a way out. Instead of thinking of curriculum as set bodies of knowledge, why not think of curriculum as inquiry? And from that moment, I've started thinking about a different way of constructing my classes. So how I teach today and what I'm experimenting with right now is how to take things that are taken for granted in my students' lives, things that concern them, whether it's in teacher education or things outside of the university, and how I can construct a course in which we begin to contextualize these things and begin to wrap context around them, to take real world phenomena and contextualize them. So as Dr. Freder indicated earlier, one of the things that's going on right now in the United States is a controversy over history and how we teach history and how we talk about race in this country. So this semester in my coursework, I've started with that and used that as a heuristic device for my students to say, let's start with this thing that you guys are worried about, that you're talking about right now. And then let's start to contextualize it and show how it's entangled and bound up with recent history and changes in politics and American culture and economics, and then connect it globally, start to build out context as we go. And what I discovered is that in so doing, I don't have to worry about disciplinary knowledge, because by building these contexts, I'm covering all of this disciplinary knowledge from political science to history to media studies and so forth. So where I am right now and the way I'm trying to think about how I'm going to get out of this stuck place as a teacher and an educator is to think about curriculum as inquiry, to stop thinking about curriculum in my teaching as transmitting fixed bodies of knowledge to my students, and to think about how I can cultivate in my students ways of thinking and being in the world. And I think that's a very different approach than we traditionally think about in education, to think about a classroom space as inquiry, as a place to help my students think about ways of thinking and being in the world as a pedagogical practice. So right now, I'm terming this, and I'm borrowing this from cultural studies, as a pedagogy of radical contextualism. And that's what I'm working on. It's an unfinished project, so I'm afraid that I don't have a clear program of study and clearly delineated pedagogy here, but that's where I'm headed. And I think this is important work for all of us, because looking around the globe, we live in a dangerous time, right? And I think we need to think about, in our classrooms and as education more generally, primary, secondary, and university education, how we can cultivate in students ways of thinking and being that can lead to a more humane world, one in which we can work across differences and we can engage in dialogue, and how we can all collectively meet the dangerous and profound challenges that we face in the early 21st century. So I hope that made sense. And I hope that had something to communicate and contribute to this conversation. And again, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you.